My name is Byron Sheldrick, and I teach at the University of Guelph. And like many of you here, I owe Leo almost everything, I think, in terms of my academic trajectory. And I don't think there's an individual who's been as significant in terms of an intellectual mentor for me, and someone who really, I think, showed me as a young PhD student how, I think, to be an academic in terms of combining kind of a public role, a role as being an activist and someone who comments on the conditions of our world, but also who takes the time to be generous with colleagues, generous with their students, and simply care about, and thinking back to the Dean's comments, care about the nature of the institution in which we work, in terms of the capacity and potential of that as a space for generating debate and creating opportunities for transformation and for transcending pessimism. And I think of Leo, I always think of someone, no matter how gloomy the news, is unrelentingly optimistic about the possibility down the road and the need to continue to struggle and work to make that happen. So I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to have an opportunity to chair this panel, thrilled I didn't have to prepare anything. That's even better, beyond saying a few nice things. So we have a great panel of individuals here to speak on the topic of struggles at home, the Canadian state, labor, and politics, and I'll just take a few minutes to introduce them. So at the end, another of Leo's students, Chris Roberts from the Canadian Labour Congress, Rosemary Warscott, I'm not going in order, I'm sorry, Rosemary Warscott from the Department of Law at Carleton University, John Peters from Laurentian, and Brian Palmer from Trent. So I think we'll go in the order on the schedule. So, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Byron. And I want to start by thanking the organizers of this great event. I'm thrilled to be included in this event. It's incredibly nerve-wracking and a bit terrifying to be involved, especially as the kickoff speaker, but I really wanted to be here to express my deep appreciation and admiration for Leo, his work, everything that's been said, his role on the left, his incredible generosity as a mentor and as a cultivator of socialists and critical thinkers, to say nothing of the intellectual rigor and his searching mind and critique that I and my comrades, my friends, came to admire and enjoy 20 years ago when I was a student here at York. So I'm really pleased, and I'm looking forward to the discussion in the 2 days here. When I was here 20 years ago, I first began to get interested in trade union strategy and politics here at York. And many of the debates at the time swirling around were on how to understand globalization and how to imagine what trade union strategy in the context of globalization could be. And really the dominant debate at the time was around progressive competitiveness. And this had a very powerful hold on the minds of social democratic thinkers and in the labor movement. And this was a strategy that Leo took on in his 2000 essay in the Socialist Register, his reflections on Andre Goritz's essay from 1964, A Strategy for Labor. That was really built around the notion that unions could offer capital the one thing that they wanted and needed, which was higher productivity. And that in the strategy, in this response to globalization, there was the promise that partnership between unions, capital, and the state, designed to train workers to become so productive that they could compete with low-wage labor abroad, or at least so innovate that they could sustain the search for niche markets, could sustain labor and trade unions through a very tumultuous and challenging moment. And under the Liberal government of David Peterson here in Ontario in the 1980s, and under the New Democratic government subsequently under Bob Rae, there was a considerable investment and energy expended in developing a vision of a high road to competitiveness. A lot of development done in building institutions around training, workforce development, labor force planning, and the like. And the strategy had important intellectual underpinnings from social democratic and liberal thought in Western Europe and the United States as well. With Leo's trenchant essay really took a bit of a class analysis scalpel to the assumptions and propositions of this strategy, and I think Leo's diagnosis at the time of the likely failures and dead end that the strategy represented had been proved prescient and true. Not only did Leo point out that its ethical failure, faulting workers and the poor for being uncompetitive instead of targeting the system itself as an engine of inequality, immiseration, and exploitation that we understand it so clearly, even more clearly today, but also pointing to the compositional fallacy at its heart, which involved promising to export unemployment to other regions. And no one could understand the European crisis and Germany's role in that without this framework for viewing that development. And the constant tendency toward overproduction inherent in a global system where everyone tries to increase their exports and limit their imports through domestic austerity, and in the financial instability that attends capital movements in such a system. So Leo wrote that the strategy partly foundered on a lack of employer interest, and it was true at the time that with wage militancy and inflation having been broken by monetarism, and with the competitive dynamic of capitalism having already asserted itself in free capital flows as well as free trade, the offer of a deal that couldn't be refused was now usually met with a shrug and a blank stare. But it wasn't just employers' shrugs and a blank stare that thwarted labor's offer of social partnership against the hopes of those that emphasized the productivity growth opportunities through collaboration. Leo had the important insight that a progressive competitiveness strategy exaggerated considerably what national capital was willing to do or could do to achieve competitiveness via social partnership. It was the increase in global financial flows that undermined the ability of employers to make bargains, even if it had been inclined to do so. And that was a very important and prescient insight, I think, that helps us understand the experience after 2000 and the contradictions in labor strategy when very high oil prices after 2002 caused the Canadian exchange rate to rise, which really caused a massive shakeout in Canadian manufacturing. Between the decade after 2002, about a quarter of Canada's manufacturing businesses closed shop. And as for anyone who's visited the industrial manufacturing centers in southern Ontario, they're really unrecognizable compared to what they were 15 years ago. And of course, productivity growth in the manufacturing sector continued, but now it was really a result of the outright closure of dozens of less productive, less profitable facilities. But overall, there was a shift in economic activity away from manufacturing and tradable sectors generally into low productivity private services. There was a similar failure of hoped for productivity growth in the oil and gas sector, as well as the boom drove investment into more and more marginal prospects that caused productivity levels to actually decline after 2003 in Alberta. So this whole strategy really foundered equally on what employers were even able to commit to, even if they had been so inclined. And within the broader context for this, of course, was the larger program of neoliberal restructuring that has been undertaken over the last 25 years with the intention of undermining unions' bargaining power and increasing the level of economic insecurity among the working class and improving the ability of employers to exploit labor. Not even that program, although it had the intended effect of really destroying a lot of workers and unions' bargaining power, and I'll come to this in a minute. It didn't even have the outcome of improving Canada's productivity performance, which actually declined further. And Canada now, since the 1980s, had one of the worst productivity growth rates in the OECD. So, but what it did do, as I said, is increase job insecurity, remove restrictions on exploitation, undermine unions. So unions today in Canada, and here's the pessimism piece, are terribly weakened. And it's really alarming and disturbing and something I think socialists, as Leo enjoined us to do in 2000, need to think very seriously about addressing. In 2 decades, private sector union coverage in Canada has fallen by a quarter, from 21% to 16%, from 36% to 25% in manufacturing. The absolute number of unionized workers in manufacturing has fallen nearly in half. The absolute number of private sector workers with union coverage is falling and has been falling steadily since 2012. There's large sectors in Canada now of strong employment growth, business services, hotel accommodation, fast food, retail, that are effectively non-union. Inequality in the working class is rising. We've seen from the most recent figures. This is a very serious problem for the labor movement, which is skewed to high earners. The highest levels of union coverage are in the 8th and 9th income deciles. Lowest coverage is in the bottom 3 deciles. The median income in that top 10% is growing faster than the middle and lower level parts of the income spectrum. And bargaining power is historically weak now in Canada. Real average hourly earnings in Canada are hovering around 80-year lows. And one can see the institutional and political expression of this weakness and disarray simply by following the news and looking at labor strategy. Leo had said at the time that the advocacy of social partnerships remains the main leitmotif of most pragmatic and moderate labor leaders, liberal and social democratic intellectuals in the new era. That's still the case, I believe. It's just that today there's no identifiable economic strategy that accompanies that advocacy of social partnerships. And so what we find is really strategic drift and disarray in many respects. The irony is that, of course, if one travels in international trade union forums, what one hears is envy for the Canadian context, an admiration of a government, federal government now that will talk to unions, that will pass or at least reverse anti-union labor legislation, that has improved public pensions and taken some other largely symbolic steps. But I think underneath that impression is something much more alarming. Let me close by pointing to what I think Leo's guideposts for breaking out of and escaping this trajectory of decline can instruct us. And the first step that Leo set out in this essay was to begin thinking ambitiously again. And I think there's an enormous relevance of that injunction. To begin to make radical demands on the state, especially around domestic control of investment. And I think that will increasingly become an opportunity, certainly for socialists and activists inside the labor movement. Now, Leo pointed to the need for a strategy for transforming and democratizing unions. This remains as a fundamental challenge, a more urgent one than ever. Leo included the search for a new anti-capitalist political organization. I suspect others on the panel will address that necessity, and building a new internationalism in response to globalization, a new strategy around globalization that is grounded, as I take it, in contesting control of private investment. And we find ourselves, and I really will close here, in a moment where there are opportunities to contest control over investment. Part of the exhaustion and illegitimacy, loss of legitimacy of neoliberalism under the Harper years here in Canada, which the NDP manifestly failed to capture and completely misread in the 2015 election. We have a renewed attention to large-scale investment in the form of infrastructure investment and a climate change agenda in Canada. What Labour was totally unprepared for was that this would be an investment strategy and agenda built around massive, large-scale privatization of public assets and really undemocratic Bay Street and Wall Street controlled investment. Similarly with the climate change agenda. Nevertheless, I think there are opportunities to generate more promising, far-reaching, and potentially even ultimately, eventually transformative ideas around seizing control of this agenda. And there are some glimmers there, at least in the union movement, with respect to the postal workers, for instance, and their program for delivering community power, which is quite an interesting package of proposals that is designed to expand public services to low-income communities, to develop a broad-based and democratic environmental transition agenda, to expand public services generally, and to build postal banking, a return to postal banking in this country, which I think would be an important step forward. On the other hand, there's still a big part of the labor movement which is seeking, as customary, and advocating for social partnerships as a route forward. So that would look like workplace joint environment committees to work with employers to green the workplace and bring down emissions, green infrastructure investments that might carry some components of training and apprenticeship requirements, and even pension fund environmentalism, which remains a keen interest in the union movement. So that remains a contested space. None of what I've addressed, though, goes to the heart of the weakness, I think, of the union movement in Canada right now, which is a real detachment from the working class, writ large detachment from the organized base of the union movement. I'm speaking mainly with respect to Canada outside of Quebec, but this still remains I guess the horizon for socialists and activists to restoring, or at least renewing, organized labor's strength in Canada and its ability to raise radical ideas and to renew working class power in politics in Canada. I'm very interested to hear what many others in the room have to say, others on the panel as well. But let me just finish by saying thank you, Leo, for giving us still a rich set of ideas and problems to wrestle with. And I'm so grateful I had a chance to work with you, to study with you, and to be here today. Thank you.